All right. So very much looking forward to the discussion today. We've got a great set of panelists, and I'm actually going to let them go ahead and introduce themselves. It looks like we didn't get Bryan included on this. He was a last minute addition. So Bryan, why don't we start with you since you weren't added to the slide, and we'll let you introduce yourself, and then we'll move on to Amie and Jess.
Hi there. Sorry, mine was restarting too. So I'm Bryan Beckman. I manage HP third-party stores, and I'm really excited to be here. So thanks for giving me an opportunity to speak, Clay.
Bryan, are you at just an amazing location, like with the overlooking the lake, or is that just a really great virtual background? Yeah.
It's a bit of a Zoom background.
Amie, how about you?
Hi, everyone. Amie Owen. I actually have had my career in Shopper since I've started in the work world. I head the Shopper Media Group and Discipline at Universal McCann. I started it from the ground up and have been here for quite some time. So happy to talk to everyone today.
And Jess, last but not least.
Yes. Hi, everyone. How are you? I head up commerce at Havas, our division of all things commerce called Havas Market, but have had experience across both the media as well as the building of our social practice that's really led to my evolution into the commerce space because there's so much happening across all of these areas. So really excited to be here and have a discussion with everyone.
We'll have to talk about the guitars in the back at some point too. So I want to know about those. Cool. So I'll kick it off with some questions, and I'll get the hell out of the way. But I think we couldn't start a panel to talk about forecasting for 2021 without talking about 2020 and what that looks like. In the sense of what we kind of just alluded to with Lisa, right? Is what is the impact that we saw from last year, and how's that impacting moving forward? I think it's interesting. Like P&G CFO in a recent earnings call said that they believe that they don't see a shift back to pre-pandemic buying behaviors. They think that what has happened is going to stay sort of as an institution moving forward from a buying behavior standpoint. Meanwhile, there's financial analysts that understand two different perspectives, certainly, but the likes of like Chewy and Peloton and some of these that saw huge increases because of what happened in the pandemic and being at home a little bit more. These financial analysts are saying, no, this is going to go back to normal behaviors. So I just sort of want to understand from the three of you, like what are your expectations for 2021 as far as consumer behavior is concerned? Maybe Jess, we can start with you and then we'll work through the rest of the group.
Sure. I think there's been a lot of really in-depth research in this space because we saw such a transformation in terms of behavior of what the consumer really does. And a lot of that was led by basically the current dynamic of the pandemic. But I do believe there are components of that transformed consumer that are going to stay. You said in the intro to the conversation, you brought up the buy online, pick up in store. I think there's elements of it in comfort for a lot of audiences that may not have traditionally accessed certain products, goods, or even telehealth services previously, but I think that will be a constant and that's going to continue. And I think there's a middle ground of some aspects that won't be as aggressive as it was during the pandemic, but I think there is a transformed consumer. We've seen so much growth in terms of accessibility for consumers, and I think we'll continue to see that acceleration.
Bryan, how about you?
So yeah, no, I think that's pretty much spot on. But I do think that there's a pretty clear delineation between what the P&G CFO is saying and discussing Peloton and Chewy. And I think, specifically regarding P&G, they're really talking about buying behavior. And I think what we've seen in 2020 is the acceleration online and really a paradigm shift of online buyers becoming repeat buyers to e-commerce platforms, and then new buyers, going online. And I think that it's going to be really interesting to understand if those online buyers remain online buyers and don't shift back to standard brick and mortar stores. And then for the new shoppers, if brands or e-commerce platforms have gained enough new shoppers to offset any deceleration that they may see from people going back to brick and mortar. So I think those could be really interesting for just, standard e-commerce platforms. But then when you take a look at the dynamics for Peloton or Chewy, which typically target online shoppers to begin with, they saw an artificial, flux of shoppers being pushed their way. I think that where their real opportunity may be is, have they leveraged that, that increase in buyer base to gain more visibility to other shoppers? And from a marketing perspective, have they been able to take advantage of that in the last 6 months to a year to really capture new market shares on a different target audience than they previously had before?
Do you think there's we're getting closer to the metaverse, right? This idea of like this seamless online to offline. I feel like that's a little bit of like the Walmart value from my perspective of like just being able to pull up, grab something, and I'm off again. So I can just seamlessly work between those worlds. Or did we get a little bit closer because of the pandemic, or did that accelerate a little bit more?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I mean, it changed consumer behavior, and what may be different for us in 2020 is kind of training us to buy online and then go pick up in store. But then you think about for a future generation, that all of a sudden becomes the new norm. So we're creating the new norm for existing shoppers, but for future shoppers, we're really setting the precedent of how it's going to look, I think, in the next few years.
Cool. Amie, how about you? What's your perspective on 2021 and just behaviors as a whole?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything that both Jess and Bryan said. I've seen a lot of, I would say, innovation or strategic thought being put into what we're doing from a media perspective. One of the bigger pieces, and kind of what I always say, is that we thought we were busy in the shopper space until COVID happened, and we didn't know what busy was. There are so much, so many new things, and so drastically changing every single day. So how do you keep up with that? And so a lot of that is driven by the consumer behavior. And I think that we are getting to as you call it, kind of a more holistic or seamless approach that really puts the consumer in the middle of how they want to shop. So if I'm a consumer, I have all these different opportunities. Do I pick up at the store? Do I order it online? Do I shop in the store? Do I order it online? And so making everything shoppable and making sure that we're talking to this given consumer is really kind of the way to be. And I think the reaction, honestly, from the whole entire pandemic, in our perspective, is how do we be agile and how do we really understand, what's going to happen as 2021 is now upon us, and we joke and say it's Q5, but I mean it's constantly moving forward in the reality of what's more to come, and we really don't know what that reality is. So like I said, agree with all fronts, but I feel like 2021 is going to be a learning year, but at the same time we have to be patient and understand where the consumer is and be able to pivot at a moment's notice.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, so we got the pandemic stuff out of the way. Let's talk about more interesting stuff. Other stuff, we'll leave it at that. D2C, so that's interesting, right? So I think that's been a huge driver of e-commerce from a general progression, a growth of the industry as a whole. Are we at the point where there's just too many options? That's my other concern. It's like you talk about the Walmart versus the small independent shop or whatever it might be. Is there just too many options for us, or is that's kind of the idea, right? Like that's capitalism at its best, or whatever you want to look at it. Is there a consolidation on the forefront? I mean, think of just like more recently Walmart and the trade desk. Now all of a sudden that becomes a little bit easier to get access to, a little bit easier to buy potentially. So Amie, we'll start with you. Like, do we think there's just too many of this stuff available? Is there a consolidation on the horizon, or we're not there yet?
Yep. Sorry, I interjected. Definitely chomping at the bit here, but from my perspective, I think that we have to take a walk before we run mentality, and we don't know what we don't know. And so I don't think there's too many options out there. I just think but depending on the brand and depending on what category you play in, like we'll understand that we have to set up test and learns and really understand what works for our given business, because someone who is in, say, like the allergy business may react differently or buy differently versus someone who's in like the chocolate or even like the computer business. So it just really just depends how the consumer behavior evolves. And so in my mind, I think that 2021, with a lot of what we're doing, is a major testing year to understand what works, what doesn't work, and then also understand what those new opportunities are and hold those, as I'll call them, slush funds aside to make sure that we are testing the new innovative opportunities for everybody.
Great. And I'm gonna come back to the how do you convince clients the testing's okay like that. But Jess, I want to hear your perspective on the sort of consolidations, or too much, not enough.
Yeah, I think it's too early to know what is too much, really. And it does come down to what is the type of business and what is the future that business brand is looking for, and starting to do that equation on that. It's like, what does the market look like? What is the demand, and where do you want customer growth to go? That really becomes the cornerstone for how you evaluate where you bring the business, whether it's DTC, whether it's expansion. Then I also think it all becomes, with this question, the previous question, infrastructure, and making sure that you properly set yourself up to be able to manage for the growth that you want, to continue to build those relationships with your current customers and retain, and be able to expand and get the visibility as to how that expansion is performing. And I think we saw a lot of businesses that went at this quickly, and it was really difficult to get the right structure in place, whether it's thinking about even the way that they're getting the data back, the way they're getting insights into their consumer, to be able to apply that to the decisions they're making from a media investment. And I think those are all questions that need to be answered before you decide what is the exact route you want to take, and if it's right for you to continue to expand in these areas, or if you should be focused.
Bryan, how about you? I think we've got agency perspective. I'd love to get sort of your perspective, and I think particular to the computer world, right? I think there's not necessarily a D2C competitor, most likely, but I certainly think the amount of competitors is probably growing.
You're absolutely right. And I think there's the amount of brand competitors and people going online, but then I think you also have to think about, there's a lot of influence from China and other types of competitors that are trying to, I guess, insert themselves in that space. And I think, I'm in complete alignment that I think it's much more, looking at it from a category perspective is really interesting. If you take just standard t-shirts, if you search for t-shirts on Amazon, you're going to get a black t-shirt, you're going to get 20,000 search results. If you search for a black t-shirt on eBay, you get 4 million. And I think as e-commerce platforms in general start to really think about user experience and what the buying experience is on their platform, that's almost going to start forcing some type of consolidation, where we start to see so many D2C sellers in the same space buying for the same, being above the fold for the same advertisements. At some point, there's kind of going to be, but sellers are going to be lost in the sea of sameness. And, it's not going to provide a great user experience if they just have a ton of redundant products that are exactly the same on their site. So I think from a platform level, to add value to your users, that's going to become more and more essential in the future with specific categories, to make sure they're elevating the sellers and the brands that are providing the best user experience versus other sellers that may not be.
Okay, and I have logistics and infrastructure questions because you both kind of talked about that, but I want to get back to Amie real quick, and I'm pointing to her like it's the Brady Bunch kind of thing going on here. But Amie, so the testing scenario, I think that's something that a lot of us love, right, as digital marketers, if you will. But how do we get stakeholders, how do you convince important stakers, CMOs, whoever it might be, that an entire year might be a testing year?
You know, it depends on what they had done in the past. If they're more of a traditional company, I think it's more of a little bit of an uphill battle because we want to make sure that we are keeping the business status quo. I think that if it's a smaller company, one that is used to kind of bouncing from, testing scenarios, it's a little bit easier. But the reality is that there's so much out there that's new. So we want to make sure that there's a fine line, and the talk track really is, let's not fix what's not broken, essentially, but then also make sure that we are making sure we're looking 5-10 years ahead of the curve, and then how do we set ourselves up for success. And a lot of what we say to our clients is, how do we future proof ourselves, and how do we bring forth really the stance of what we'll have in 5 years, and then also in 10 years. So that's really the conversation that we're actually having today, and we had it a few months ago, as the pandemic was here to stay, and the realization that some things may not change. So really trying to not necessarily take a reactive approach, but a proactive approach, and then make sure that we're still in it for the long haul.
Fair enough. So is there like an 80-20 kind of rule to that? Is there anything that you take normally, or is it just?
It's usually like I would say like a 90-10, depending on if you're more traditional. Some of our clients have actually done like a 50-50, but again, it depends on budgets, how well you're doing, what category, like how aggressive your category is. So there's a lot of factors that come into play. So there's no, set rule or standards. It's just more of the matter of, how do you, again, sustain your business, and then also really dip your toe into that testing waters.
Yes, I saw you nodding.
I would say I feel like I have similar conversations to Amie, but it really comes down to making sure that you can do it intelligently, right? You set up and understand what is going to be deemed as the what you need to get from it. What is it? I keep saying infrastructure and don't want to use that word again, but making sure that you're getting the information back to be able to identify what you can take away from that test in the scenario that you're looking at, I think is also just a key point to any balance of the tried and true and innovation. And certainly in this space, there's a lot of want, there's a lot of need for things like rapid prototyping so that you can get learnings quickly and start to apply that and start to change and be as responsive as possible. So it's kind of a balance and really working with the brand to be able to put that in place and be able to keep everything moving forward when so much is new.
Okay. Cool. So I'm going to bounce around a little bit. So Bryan, you had talked about, particularly your brand, the sort of the Chinese influx, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the sort of logistics. I think we saw last year, I mean, hand sanitizer or toilet paper, right? It's like the obvious example, but it's like in computers, there's parts that are probably coming from all over the world. Of course, I'm making assumptions. I don't know this, but I'm assuming, right? Mm-hmm. And there's, influx of cheaper stuff coming potentially from China. We saw, there was a problem with sort of the logistics of just having enough inventory, right? Because of the influx that we saw. But is that an underlying issue with just e-commerce as a whole? Or is that purely just the demand was so quickly so high that there was no way to keep up with it, or obviously foresee a pandemic coming? But what are the logistics ready for a huge influx of e-commerce?
I think it was a little bit of the perfect storm. And which isn't a great answer, but I think, you look at everything from just a shortage of raw materials to political, to socio-economical challenges across the board globally. And I think all those factors certainly came into account this last year, which really did drive shortages across the board for I would assume any real industry that saw a huge influx in demand. And I don't necessarily know if it really is saying that there's a shortcoming on brands really being able to have enough supply, but I do think that brands in general will need to take a step back and look at their supply chains and really rethink how they're doing business today. And then, kind of like, to steal your word, how they future-proof things in the in the next 3 to 5 years. I think that things will look drastically different. And how can they avoid shortages like this type? I think that, just-in-time inventory and things of that nature have been extremely important for the past 10 years for brands in general, streamlining a lot of those processes. And what does that actually look like in the upcoming years? I think it's going to be really interesting.
Yes, Amie, anything to add on that one? I know it was kind of I think more of a brand question from a logistics standpoint, but
I would just echo what Bryan said. I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of conversations that we do have with brands is that they have really high ambitions, but again, I'll use that mentality that I said earlier. You have to sometimes crawl before you walk. So we need to make sure that everything is set up for success in the matter of like how you're going to market your business in a different way before we get there. So our goal is really to help build out that marketing plan that really starts with phase 1 and brings you through whatever phase you want to get to.
The only thing I'd add is, thinking about all of these components and making sure that they have it set up prior to going into market with some of the drivers of volume. So before you put $1 into market, have you thought about taking the learnings, what we've found out with inventory and logistical elements, and set up the right experience and the right response strategy so that you're monitoring that and seeing what's happening as the campaigns are in market and able to action on that and actually respond if you're seeing low inventory, things of that nature. So it's just, I think everyone learned a lot in the past 6 to 12 months, even though it was something that was a consideration. I think the scale at which it's considered now is much greater.
Yeah, I'm going to bounce around again. I talked a little bit about sort of consumer choice and the expansion. Now let's talk about the consolidation. How about media planners' choice, right? It seems like every major retailer on the planet is now opening up their own marketplace, right? Walgreens, CVS, Home Depot, Walmart, like you name it. How do we prepare for that? Like how, as media planners and as stewards of budgets, how do we decide where those fits and who gets what? Is it just this ongoing, maybe a giant test scenario of these platforms, or is there, does it change your strategy overall, knowing that I now have 55 choices versus 5 years ago I had 2? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I could jump in here. I think in my mind, it's not necessarily having the test plans. It's just making more strategic and smart choices of how we're going about testing. And so a lot of clients, have specific retailers that they work with from a mass perspective, from grocery, et cetera. So they already have those relationships. So what does it look like from a lean in perspective in testing that model? But then also from, our perspective in the agency world, how do we compare and then put, them apples to apples and see what's working, what's not working? So really just trying to make sure that when we are entering into the retail media network space, that we're not only comparing them versus themselves, but also maybe results that were on kind of like the bigger media companies to understand, what's right for the business. I know that there is something that I always throw out there, return on retail relationship. And so from that perspective, like we're going to have to work with the retailers. We like to work with the retailers, but then there's going to be a give and take when it comes to how much we're going to play in that space. So again, it more comes down to me anyway, those smart choices and making sure that we make all of our choices ingrained in the data in which we have or which we're building on behalf of our client.
Is there and just let me ask you this, and a little bit on the spot, but as a brand, and say like, I want my brand to have more shelf space in Walgreens or CVS, whatever it might be. Is there a play for brands to say, okay, maybe if I go and all of a sudden I'm spending a whole bunch more money in advertising on that marketplace, that I get the attention of one of these large brands? Is that seems like a legit strategy?
I think it absolutely should be an approach that any retail trade team is considering, both the in-store, what the overall partnership looks like, and how that translates to media. I think it's also based on what you know about the customers that are retailing in these environments. And is there something that you can share that is a leverage point with the retailer to start to think about how you scale that relationship and apply that to the decisions you make from a media perspective? So my main goal with working with brands is that you don't consider one without the other. certainly there's the media components of the retail media, but what do you already know about the relationship the brand has, the product sell-through in those environments, and the customer themselves? And is there value to investing in growing that particular stream of customers, or is there more that you want to get out of it, especially in terms of understanding data? What does that look like? I think it's really interesting where the retail media networks are, and certainly it's in a more nascent stage. They're looking to, I think, mature quickly, certainly with Walmart Connect announcement last week and some of the more accessibility they're looking to provide into the marketplace in the ways that you can access inventory. So I think there's a lot there, but they should be considered holistically as part of the entirety of your ecosystem, from customer to product to where the consumer wants to purchase.
Okay, perfect. And Bryan, I'll jump to you in questions too. So we're going to jump to Q&A very quickly. So if anybody has those, pop those in the chat for us. But Bryan, I think as you think about your business, you know, I've thrown out Walgreens, CVS, Home Depot. Those obviously aren't relevant for you, but is Amazon just it? Is it Amazon? Is it Best Buy? Like what's, you know, are you seeing as much of this marketplace confusion and opportunity as maybe a CPG brand were?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that, you know, from kind of a media perspective, you really have to start taking a step back and looking at everything from a holistic brand strategy and what your real goals are that you're trying to accomplish. I know, you know, and especially as these retail marketplaces really start to gain traction, you can think about it from one where, you know, the brand sells directly to that Walgreens, and you may look to elevate the visibility of your products not only on the website, but then also within the store. And then, you know, you may be selling directly to that website, but you also may have a third-party store on that website where you could potentially supplement the products that you're not selling to that brand. And then there's also a lot of these retail marketplaces are creating ad placements where you can actually send ads directly back to your own brand website and capture some of that that qualified market share. So, you know, but I think when you take a look at the holistic brand strategy, it really comes back to the user and how you can really, I guess, improve the overall user's journey and elevate the buying experience across platforms, you know, regardless if it's on Walgreens, if it's on your third-party store on Walgreens, or if it's on your own website, like, and that really making that connection to, I guess, showing the intrinsic value from a brand perspective to online to offline from a direct perspective and then back to your own store, I think is going to be really important in the future.
And before we jump into the QA, so this will be last one before we jump into audience Q&A, but this is sort of I love to end the panels like this, sort of put the Swami hat on and say, like, what's the next big thing, or what's the thing that you've seen over the last 12 months or 6 months or yesterday that you think is particularly interesting? Like what's the trend that's happening that you think has the potential to sort of pop soon? So Jess, we'll start with you on that one.
So I don't know if I would say this is something that's pop, but it's something we talk a lot about, is just the value of considering social platforms when you're thinking about e-commerce and not thinking them as individual marketplaces. I think the aspect of the functionality and where the platforms have gone in terms of being able to transact and stay within the environment, tying that to the content experience and the social proof that comes within that, provides a value in terms of product discovery versus someone already in market saying, hey, I'd like to go buy this product. So for me, it's more of a discussion when we're talking with brands and clients about what their ecosystem looks like and making sure that they're not missing that as a considered marketplace. I think would be one of the key points that I would highlight.
Awesome. Amie, how about you?
I think in a broad stroke, I would say technology, but one of the pieces that I'm actually really intrigued about, and I know that I've talked about it with my team and others, but really the return of, like I said, the QR code. So how do you use your phone to actually engage in a now touchless environment when you're shopping in the store.
Yeah.
So I feel like that honestly is really interesting. And then also the technology that you can embed into a lot of your digital campaigns to make everything shoppable across the web. So technology is really going to play a focal piece in really tying everything together for the consumer themselves. So I'm interested to see what's more to come there.
Bryan, how about you?
So I think I have a slightly different perspective. I mean, first and foremost, working from home's kind of here to stay for the near term. And I think that's certainly going to have a huge influence on the electronic industry. But I also think that, from an electronics perspective and just kind of from a consumer perspective, 2020 has made everything readily available. So how do brands with similar products really start to differentiate themselves? And resonate with their audience. And I think one of the things that has really come front and center in the last few months, and I think will continue to become increasingly important, is social consciousness around the environment. And from a brand perspective, what they're doing around sustainability and how they're potentially leveraging that in a marketing aspect. Versus maybe just focusing on, a sale or things like that. Really thinking about, building that rapport with the customer and increasing that engagement and really, I guess, connecting with them at a different level.
It's an interesting one because I was reading this morning from another publication that shall not be named, but there was a research recently about how consumers are particularly saying like they don't want to see the sort of bullshit from brands anymore. It's like either take a real stance and make real movement, or stop with the changing of your icons on Facebook. Like that's so transparent, so obvious. Interesting perspective. So we got social commerce from Jess. We've got QR codes from Amie and their comeback. We had talked about print yellow pages back in the day, and QR codes is an interesting way to go about it. And Bryan's work from home and sustainability. Is that did I nail him?
Yep.
All right, I did my job.
Hey, Clay.
Steve, questions?
See ya. By the way, I should mention, Clay is a longtime member of our advisory board who advises us on content for these events, and also has been a longtime friend of the Search and Performance Insider Summit.
Absolutely.
Has been a programmer, and thanks as always for that, and good to see you again. We have a couple of questions over the transom. One is about predictions or thoughts about pricing in the coming year. I know to sort of complement this, I know that in talking to a lot of media buyers and especially brands, there was a lot of, because of you had a lot of new consumers coming into a lot of new categories in e-commerce, there was a lot of price pressure, especially at the top of the funnel for general brand searches around categories. I'm curious what you guys anticipate in terms of pricing across search and performance over the next year.
So I think I could jump in a little bit there, but essentially what we saw was really just like the hockey stick, right? So pricing shot up. That was the beginning of pandemic. I want to say it sustained itself a little bit throughout the summer. And what we started actually seeing at the end of, the holiday timeframe and January, now that it's February, is really seeing it level out. So I do think that it might sustain itself a little bit higher than the norm, but I think with any new category, you're going to see that uptick right away, and then it kind of drop and kind of level to where it's going to stay. The other thought process around just like the pricing in general is that it's probably going to be on the high side, just because there's going to be new buyers in the marketplace, as you mentioned, and it costs more to get a new buyer down the funnel. So yes, it will sustain itself, but it might just be slightly higher than what we're used to actually engaging with.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Bryan?
Yeah, anybody else want to jump in on that one, or is that did she cover it? Okay. The other one is about cookies tracking, ID tracking. What impact you expect, what you're preparing for over the next year as we start seeing the Apple ID become purely opt-in, as we start seeing browsers increasingly, including Chrome, making cookies opt-in. What sort of impact is that going to have, and what sort of countermeasures are you already starting to put in place?
I mean, I can jump in, but I was trying to trying not to take the spotlight.
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So essentially what we're trying to figure out is how to function in a cookieless world. So really making sure that we're having one-to-one matches and not really leaning on the cookie technology. So although I can't disclose some of the confidentiality that we have from an agency perspective, it is top of mind when it comes to reaching the consumer. And as I mentioned, at the top of the panel, it really is, the focal point on the consumer. So understanding and making sure that we are hitting them within content that they are going to engage with on the specific platforms, and then also making sure that we understand what those behaviors are and how they change is really going to be crucial to the strategy in future.
Yeah, just to build on that, similarly, the overall goal is to just live within a cookieless world, understand compliance and the privacy of the consumer, which puts a lot more of an emphasis on things like content and context and how you can translate to what you know about your customer based on that relationship you have with them and that ownership of that data. So there's a lot of work that it depends on the brand, it depends on the industry, how that translates to who their customers are, but ultimately very similarly down the same path.
Bryan, I'd be curious from a brand's perspective, how do you come at that?
Well, I think it's going to almost make it more important that brands are building communities and relationships with their customers than it ever has been before. Having someone that acquiring new customers, but also making sure you're retaining those existing customers, and then new customers that you're acquiring, really building that personal relationship with them, so you have an open line of communication with them, which can give you more visibility into kind of their behavior and what they may find relevant or may not. I know that it's obviously top of mind for our brand, and there's a whole lot of teams working on the solutions. But at a high level, I think that we're really looking at how we can not just acquire and then retain that customer and engage with them more often than we've been previously.
Well, listen, Bryan, Jessica, Amie, and of course, Clay, thank you so much. Great panel. A lot of good stuff in there. Appreciate it. See you. We hope we see you live later in the year at the next Search and Performance Summit.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.